The Y Curve with Phil Dobby and Roger Hearing.
Are you a property owner? Well done. You've got something that few Britons under 35 can aspire to, ever.
Well done. Unless you can't afford the mortgage, and like millions this month are finding their payments have doubled or trebled as a fixed rate ends in a Bank of England made financial disaster.
Either end of the housing system, it isn't working, and even renting has become a crazy cutthroat business, leaving many young adults living with parents well into their 30s.
Is it because we're not building enough houses, or the wrong type of houses, or in the wrong places?
Does the whole system of buying and selling and borrowing need a big overhaul?
Has the UK built itself a 7-storey, fully furnished, double-fronted nightmare?
That's this week on The Y Curve, brought to you by Wigmore Associates.
The Y Curve.
I just wonder whether, the horse is already bolted. I mean, you can't... House prices are so high now. Those people with a house are not going to give it away. I speak for someone who's, got a very hefty mortgage. I would not like to see...
Tell me about it, as they say.
Yeah, we're in that boat. So, I mean, even though the younger generation will go, well, look at these middle-aged people who've got these properties. A lot of us are still in our dotage, let's be honest, still paying off those mortgages.
Now facing larger repayments on the basis that vast numbers of people, their fixed-rate mortgages have now come to an end. So, and it's a big top-up.
And we would not be happy to see house prices come down. So we're paying a mortgage with negative equity so the young people can afford to buy a house.
Which they can't.
That
is the biggest and worst part of it, because in the end, somehow we'll muddle through retirement, whatever. But the young people who can't... They can't buy a place. They can't even dream of buying a place.
Yeah.
The average house price in London, is over 700,000.
I know, it's crazy. It's just nuts, isn't it? I guess the one argument is that if you've got kids, they're going to inherit the house at some point, so they'll be all right. But those people who haven't got parents with their houses, I mean, it's just dividing society, obviously.
And even if you're not anywhere near that, I mean, the alternative is renting, obviously, and actually, large parts of Europe, that's what most people do. We're a property-owning democracy in a way that's quite unusual in Europe. But in the renting sector, the stories you hear, it has gone completely mad. There are occasions, it's like buying a house now. When you rent it, you go along to bid almost. How much will you pay rent for this place? The choices are so slim.
So does that mean landlords are being greedy? Well, you would be, wouldn't you? If there's greater demand than there is supply.
And you've got to pay a higher mortgage maybe on the property that you're trying to rent out. I mean, all these things are playing into it.
More than half of all households in London are renting. So I just wonder whether we are going into just generation rent. We just have to accept it. And, there are parts of the world, like Switzerland, for example, has more than half the population in Switzerland still rents. Germany as well, up there as well. We're about a third, I think, but more than half in London.
Yeah.
So do we just have to accept that we're going to go the way of, other developed Western countries? And is there anything wrong with that?
Well, the only thing wrong with it is that we don't have a rental sector that's really geared up for that. Hence, there's nuts stuff about how difficult it is for people to get places to rent and how sky high the rentals are. In Berlin recently, they had a rent freeze. And there was huge hoo-ha about that. But it was confronting a problem that does exist in other parts of the world. But here, I think it's particularly true because we haven't been historically so much probed towards renting.
Well, look, if you aren't struggling with how you're going to raise money for rent or to buy a house, but actually you're more concerned about how you maximise the money that you do have, then Wigmore Associates are the people who can help. They are a private wealth management services company, and they can help individuals and trusts covering everything from pensions, tax planning, and inheritance tax advice, which is what we've been talking about, what you do with a house after you've gone. These days, of course, the regulatory landscape is as complex as ever. There are over 2,400 pages of legislation in the tax code. How to get to the bottom of that? Well, they can help you. So give them a call. Wigmore Associates, a boutique asset management firm based in London. Wigmore-associates.co.uk is their website, or you can give them a call on 0207 224 3400. That is Wigmore Associates.
Yeah, and they are backing us and making this whole podcast possible. And today, of course, our subject, as we said, is housing, the housing crisis. And joining us, I'm very pleased to say, is Mark Stevens. He's Professor of Land, Property and Urban Studies at Glasgow University, a long-time observer of Britain's difficult housing sector and how governments variously have tried to tackle it, and indeed what should be done. Let's bring him in now.
So, Mark, I mean, house prices are still going up, aren't they? That is the surprising thing. I mean, if we look at, where they are compared to before the pandemic, I think they've gone up basically by a quarter in price in the UK, and you would have thought, everything was fighting in the other direction, and yet, there's that resilience in the housing market. Does it surprise you?
It does surprise me, given how much interest rates have gone up. But the housing market always is there to surprise us. So, I think when the pandemic came, we expected something of an implosion, and the government certainly did because of all the stimulus it gave to the housing market. But then it turned out that the ultra low interest rates that the pandemic gave us, if you like, spurred another boom,
and a bit of cash in our bank accounts as well.
Well, it hasn't lasted long, but there was a bit. I suppose the thing with it, as you say, it is unpredictable, or seems to be unpredictable. But is that because we still don't really understand the housing sector in the way it performs and why?
And is it unpredictable? Because even though it might level off, it never seems to really go down. I mean, the predictability seems to be, if you've got the money, it's going to go up at some point.
I think that's a really good point, that the housing system is immensely complex if you think about it, numerous factors that affect it. So, we can think of sort of fundamentals like household growth or population growth, income growth or stagnation, interest rates. But there's clearly a lot going on. And I suppose a lot of people would argue that it's the sort of fundamental imbalance in the market that we haven't been building enough houses for a long time. And if you have that kind of shortage, then that is going to, put an upward pressure on house prices.
Well, that, as you say, is one of the fundamentals and one of the things we want to talk about. So do you think it is true? I mean, you've studied this for a long time. Are we simply not building enough houses, or not the right houses, or not in the right places?
And why? I mean, if prices are going up, why wouldn't developers be pulling out all the stops to build more and more?
Well, there's a whole host of points in there, but the last one you make about why aren't the house builders going ahead? And I think we need to understand the house building industry a lot better, because if you just stand back and look at it, it is actually quite concentrated in the sense that a lot of the market is dominated by relatively few companies. So it's not really a competitive market in the way that you want it to be. And basic economic theory would say, well, if you have that lack of competition, then these companies are going to have an influence over oversupply, because and we know that they drip feed local markets, in order to prevent additional supply from bringing prices down. So whilst a lot of people, the sort of knee-jerk reaction is to say it's NIMBYs and the planning system, I think we also have to look at the house builders and that kind of model, that speculative built model that the UK has.
All of a sudden, just listening to you talk explains why we've got a big patch of land in the centre of my town, which was planning permissions being granted to build an apartment block, and it's just not moving. So they're hanging on to it because they know there's a lot of housing going on, and they want to, as you say, drip feed, so that they don't affect the local house price market. Do you think that's what's going on? I mean, you don't know the individual case, but is that the sort of thing that's going on?
I don't know the individual case, but Oliver Letwin's review he did on this a few years ago, which was an excellent piece of work, draws it out very clearly that what the house builders have done since the financial crisis is to what they call de-risk. So they've gone for larger sites on green fields. And if you have that kind of big site, then that's obviously going to open you up to having control over the prices or wanting to drip feed the market. So, I mean, I think one of the things government seems to forget is that it is itself a big player in this. The planning system is not just a sort of licensing system. You put in an application and it gets approved or not. There's an economics to it, and the government owns the development rights. So the government itself could be much more proactive in bringing the land to the market.
Well, there was a move, wasn't there, to fine companies, I think, or to take away permission if it wasn't used in a certain time. There was certainly government initiatives in that sort of area. Is that the kind of thing that we need?
At least force them to sell. I mean, rather than having this landline dormant.
There have been lots of, I mean, you could use taxation to do that. I mean, if you started taxing it at residential use value, then that might concentrate minds. So I think that those kind of instruments, we should look at. But just to make everyone feel uncomfortable, but also say another part of supply is within the existing stock and how we use it. There's a lot of under-occupation in the housing system. People hang on to houses when perhaps they might downsize as they get older.
Is that the case, though, that actually happens? I mean, people talk about downsizing. I mean, first of all, you've got to sell your house. There's got to be someone who's actually got the money to pay what you're expecting for it. And then people do hang on to those houses, don't they? Because it's the only way they're going to get the kids and grandkids to come and stay. I mean, the kids come and want to see the room that they grew up in. So there's an emotional attachment. So I wonder whether, most people actually do downsize and should you have to? Why can't you hang on to the family home?
Well, that applies to some people. It doesn't apply to everyone. And it's a question of how do we tax housing compared to other things, and we give housing an easy ride. And it seems to me we want the best of both worlds. We want to protect asset values of people who own houses, and we want to make housing more affordable to people who don't have them. Now, clearly, you can't do both. Existing homeowners have had a long-term bonanza. And I think I'm one of them, should recognise that. And
equalisation between the generations in some ways. But also, Mark, what about the nature of those houses? Because we've been talking about housing as if it's one type, but of course there is housing that's more affordable, social housing, if you like, all kinds of things like that, which again developers don't seem to put out there and would be essential for the other end of the market where people are trying to join.
Well, that's you've highlighted the big gap. I mean, if you go back to 1970, housing output from the private sector was roughly what it is now, but overall supply was considerably greater, and the gap is the loss of new social housing, and of course that arose from the turn against social housing, and in particular the turn against housing supplied by local authorities.
So just to put some numbers on that, 5.5 million social houses in 1979. In 2021, the latest number I could find, it's 4.1 million. So it had a 25% drop over 40 years when the population had risen by 20%. So that's quite alarming, isn't it, really?
It is, yes. And it's something that needs consistent political support to reverse that situation. And, I would point to Scotland as having, made some progress in this direction. So Scotland ended the right to buy, and the roof didn't cave in. It was politically possible to do it, and it has revived, the output of social and affordable housing. Both from housing associations and local authorities.
And does Scotland have a less of a problem as a result?
Well, it does, yes. I think the pressures are less in Scotland anyway, but there is more social housing in Scotland, and there's a greater supply of new social housing in Scotland. And of course, it's new housing that provides the easiest route of access. Of course, there are enormous pressures in Scotland. One of them is the much wider coverage of homelessness protection in Scotland. So local authorities are responsible for any group who's unintentionally homeless, not just those who are in so-called priority need. So the responsibilities are greater, but there are parts of Scotland, for example, where I live, which is in a small town in the Central Belt, is that the new social housing is playing the role that it used to more generally, which is to sort of provide a sort of wider affordability function for the wider population, and not just a kind of safety net for those in the greatest need.
So that would be something that, I mean, for the sake of argument, maybe an incoming Labour administration might have quite near the top of its list to change the rules here to try and encourage something similar.
Well, it ought to. I mean, it's an aspect, I think, of the Labour programme that maybe they're a bit quiet on, and certainly that was one of the big disappointments of the last Labour government. They did have a programme to upgrade the existing social stock, the Decent Homes programme, but they were very, very reluctant to allow return to house building on any scale in the social sector.
We know why that is, though, don't we? Because it's politically untenable, because of the situation you were talking about earlier, where you can't have both. You can't lower prices so houses become more affordable without people fearing that they're going to lose a lot or get into negative equity if they're sort of midway through a hefty mortgage. I mean, I know you're over there in Australia at the moment. You're in Sydney, which has got crazy house price. I mean, I was priced out of Sydney. That's why I'm back in the UK, because house prices have got so crazy there, and governments on both sides won't touch it because they'll make noises, but generally they won't tackle the issue head on.
I don't see how increasing the supply of social housing in any way threatens existing homeowners' equity. I don't quite follow.
You don't think it brings down prices generally? It just adds to the supply, and that would bring prices down? You think it would the distinct markets?
It's a fairly convoluted route, I think. It requires political commitment. It's been done in Scotland, to an extent in Wales. We now have a very large, or much larger, private rented sector, which, as we all know, is insecure. I mean, of course, the security could be improved, but also just inherently more expensive. So, one of the drivers of rising poverty as a result of housing costs is quite straightforwardly the tenure shift. So there are people who, in a previous generation, would either have become homeowners or gone into social housing, who are now all in the private rented sector.
That's a really interesting point, because there was one I wanted to come on to, the fact that so many, we call them generation rent or whatever it is, are unable to even think of getting a deposit, go on the housing ladder at all, and are either living with their parents or renting. The rental market seems to have gone crazy. Certainly in London, it's people having to do things that they'd normally have to do if they were buying a house in order to rent a house, which seems crazy.
More than half of the households in London, we were saying earlier before we started talking to you, are rented. But in Switzerland, 57%, Hong Kong, 49%, Germany, 48%, and we're about a third. So in terms of the proportion of households that are renting. So, I mean, has the horse bolted? Do we have to say we are going the same way as those other countries, and we have to accept that it is generation rent?
Well, it's a long haul to get back to the kinds of levels of home ownership we had 20 years ago, and if you look at the age cohorts, the changes are quite dramatic. So no, I don't think in the near term we're going to restore those levels of home ownership. So we are going to have more renting, and the questions are, what's the mix of renting between social and market going to be? And how are we going to regulate the private market? And are we going to try and change the nature of that by encouraging the institutional investment that you see in build to rent? That's an area I do expect a Labour government, and they're elected next year, to focus on, because that is part of the supply equation.
Just explain how that would work. I mean, what are the kind of things that the Labour government, potential Labour government, could do?
Well, I suppose if it's so minded, then it can look at the taxation of the sector to see if the playing field is even or not. But I wouldn't want to go too far in saying that this is a sector that needs special government assistance, because the market factors are kind of falling into place that should support it and allow it to scale up. And once it scales up, then it kind of becomes a mature sector. The risks go down, and it should gain momentum. And I think we've seen that actually in the purpose-built student accommodation sector, which in principle is the same thing. It's institutional investment for rent. It came from nowhere. It's now really quite large, and it's mature in the sense that the players in the market sold. There's a second-hand market.
So you think it will almost naturally even out the problems we're talking about? And I've certainly heard from my kids and elsewhere about the difficulties of renting and the issues and the prices. You think, in general, that will, as you say, mature quite soon? In
that market, I expect it to grow and eventually to mature. I wouldn't put a time frame on it. Going back to the beginning of our discussion, trying to second guess the housing market in any detail is perhaps unwise. But it really requires a sort of all hands on deck. It's no single instrument or policy or section of the market is going to solve the problems that we're in. So it does, I think, require government action on land supply, land preparation. I think it does require how we think about how we tax housing. It does require a commitment to new social and affordable supply. And it does require some reconsideration of how the private rented sector works. And of course, we have the Renters Reform Bill at last, long overdue. Going back to Scotland, the security of tenure has been increased enormously. And it looks like we're heading to some kind of system of rent controls. And, these are areas that are going to require very careful policies because, if they go too far and landlords start selling up, then there's going to be another dynamic there that could create a spiral of shortage. And
you think there is a risk of that?
Oh, yes. I mean, historically, you have to be very careful about how you design rent control. Personally, I'm, more in favour of the sort of so-called second generation rent control, the kind of ideas of rent pressure zones, which is to moderate increases in areas that are very pressurised, rather than a sort of blanket system of rent caps. So
just expand on that. You mean there'll be certain areas, certain parts of the country, certain parts of a city where you'd have different regulations, in effect?
So let's take London, for example, where obviously there's a squeeze in demand, and I can see that is only going to rise. So that should be treated very differently to, for example, somewhere in Leicester.
Yes, I mean it does. It's not necessarily the case that year on year London has the fastest rent rises, and there are differences within London. So what I have in mind more is smaller market areas, looking and where there is rapid increases of rents within tenancies, then those are the kind of areas you might want to say, look, this market's overheating. That landlords are able to exploit the relationship with their sitting tenants. So what we should do is to moderate rent increases there over a period of say 3 or 4 or 5 years.
So we've been talking largely about supply being the actual issue, that there's just not enough houses to go around. I mean, obviously people are living, we're not having a quarter of the population living on the streets. So obviously people are finding somewhere to live. So how much of it is supply, and how much is the other side of the equation? How much of it is easy credit coming from banks?
Well, that again is a vital element in the equation. I mean, econometricians have various estimates, but long term, maybe a third, maybe even a half of rise in house prices has come about by the until very recently the long-term fall in interest rates, and it's instructive now that with interest rates where they are, we're talking about them as they're extraordinarily high. Well, of course, historically, they're not really. And so, of course, they're negative in real terms. And inflation is, just below 10%, I think, today. Interest rates aren't that high. So they're negative. So, those with a long memory might remember 1988 when interest rates doubled from roughly 7 to 50%.
Yeah, some of us went into negative equity at a fairly rapid rate.
And that, I mean, very painful though it was, badly handled. I mean, that was a housing market correction that restored affordability. So in mid-90s, affordability had been restored. And then we had the very, very long boom going up to the financial crisis. And then again, government did everything it did to protect house prices. So a lot of this is about, the priority in economic policy is to protect house prices. So an element in this really ought to be to finding ways to allow the housing market to correct. And I think actually longer term, it would be good for the housing market and probably for the wider economy if we had sensible levels of interest rates rather than these what were meant to be temporary measures.
How much of it is interest rates and how much of it is just the bank saying, yeah, sure, you can have a loan? Because interest rates go up and down. So, I mean, and it is interesting. There's this resilience that's going on right now. And, there's an argument that, well, people are looking through those interest rates and saying, well, I'm going to buy now because I know those rates are going to go down. But if we look at household debt in the UK, 700 billion in the year 2000. In 2007, I mean, they were the real growth years, weren't they, in the early 2000s? It was 1.5 trillion. So in 7 years, effectively household debt had doubled. So, and obviously that household debt was people taking out bigger mortgages because banks would let them.
Yeah, and refinancing to support consumption. I mean, one of the issues is unequal access to credit. I mean, part of that is because of regulation. Fairly sensible affordability and stress tests were introduced after the financial crisis, and some people say they should be relaxed. I'm not one of them. But what we've had with these ultra low interest rates is that the older generation who got their houses were able to afford the deposits to access the cheap credit, then to rent out houses they bought to the people who can't afford them. It was, of course, deeply inequitable and it makes housing an engine of inequality. One of the difficulties when you've got very high house prices is that, not being able to get 100% mortgage, say, isn't really the problem because if you can't afford to repay.
Unless you regulate the bank. So it's not, I mean, there is that issue about, the people who can't afford it and trying to get them off renting into actually getting a loan, which a bank may say no because it's too high risk. So banks instead will go to those people who can afford to pay and they'll say, sure, we'll give you a massive loan because you've got so much equity. You're low risk to us. For a bank, we like that because we've got the collateral that's sitting alongside this loan. I mean, hell, the other alternative would be for us to use that money to lend to business for economic growth. But no, we'll take the housing option because that's safer. And so you get this housing boom. I mean, that has to be a big part. When you see that big increase in the level of household debt, which is predominantly housing, is driven by the finance sector saying, yes, we're going to give safe loans to people, and that's boosting house prices. Can't you see that's what's happening?
That was kind of the scenario I was outlining.
But it's inflating prices.
But you only restore access to credit safely by allowing house prices to fall. That's the long and short of it. And of course, one element in the housing market, of course, is that it's not just demand and supply as you would get with consumer durables. It's also an asset. So there is expectations of future prices play a role in current demand. So if people...
which is why it's been so desirable over the years, or seemed to be so. But what about this whole issue of, is the housing market you almost said it was just now, a vehicle of inequality. Is it actually a desirable thing, socially as well as economically, to have a property-owning democracy?
Well, the kind of property-owning democracy that many Anglophone countries had, say in the 1980s, that growth in home ownership actually took place it varies between countries, but say in the UK, it grew from the 1930s onwards, and it grew on the back of a mortgage finance system that was quite effective, but pretty highly regulated and uncompetitive. And it's really since we deregulated the finance system in the 1980s that you've had these swings in credit, an overall increase in the supply of credit. And of course, that is one of the factors that has driven up house prices. And ironically, it's become self-defeating. It's, they say revolutions, consume their children. Well, that is one revolution that is literally, well, not literally, but metaphorically consuming our children. The property-owning democracy, fueled by this deregulated finance system, has ultimately, it can't go on forever because people are priced out.
Well, and the divide continues, though, doesn't it? So those people who've got houses will pass it on to their kids. Those people who don't have houses won't pass it on to their kids. And, you could see that, there's an intergenerational wealth issue going on.
That's right. Yes. So now your ability to access home ownership, of course, is going to be related also to your parents' ability to help you.
Are we then on the brink of some major change in this, do you think, or is it just going to bubble on as it has been?
And Daisy, it sounds like we need regulation, a bag of regulations. So, for example, rent controls. Maybe banks do need to be controlled in their lending behaviour. We do need to see more social housing and things like, trying to get developers to provide low cost housing. That's, things like that just haven't worked, have they? But it seems like it's a regulation issue that is going to counter this. We can't just let it carry on.
No, we can't. Well, we shouldn't allow it to carry on. I rather fear that in general we are. It's a classic case of the sort of political economy of housing is that the insiders, if you like, are still in terms of politics the most influential. So that makes it more difficult. But I think. We do need to sit down and say this is a crisis. I'm not generally in favour of calling everything a crisis, still less an existential crisis. But I think we do have a housing crisis, and I think the only kind of approach that will work are two things. One is that it needs to be broad-based, so touch all the elements of the housing system, and it also needs to command consensus to an extent between parties, because it's going to be a long haul, and I think it needs some kind of acceptance by the older generations, if you like, that things are going to have to change. And so I think we do need a national conversation. And
that national conversation so far has been basically people saying, "Oh, it's easy to resolve. There's just too many migrants coming into the country." So that is a complete furphy, isn't it? Proportional to the size of this issue, that's nothing at all.
But the conversation is, as you say, crucial. And we're going to have to draw it to an end there. But Mark, we've been having the conversation, and thank you very much for doing that. A lot to think about, and as you say, a crisis that has to be acknowledged, and hopefully we've done our bit in acknowledging
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much.
Goodness knows how this in reality is resolved. I remember one thing my dad saying, my dear old late dad, that he was the generation that had it easy. Because, he was at the stage where, buying a house would be, 2.5 times your income. Incomes were a lot lower. Expectations were lower as well. True.
Houses were worse in many ways.
Yeah.
Although, actually, in terms of building standards, some things have gone down
higher,
as well.
But but that expectation, we went from a small house to a slightly less small house to a slightly larger house. It was all very gradual. There wasn't that rush that we've got these days, or young people seem to have. So I don't know whether expectation is part of it as well. And you can't blame young people for that, because that is peer pressure, of course. Well, and we're in a world where everything has to move quickly.
We blame young people for most things. Truth be told.
Okay, it's their fault then. Fair enough.
Well, let's talk about the badness of a slightly older generation, because that is going to be our subject next week.
Yeah.
We're going to be talking about those who rule us, those who we elect to rule us, those who make big decisions on our behalf, and what we expect of them.
Is rule the word? Do they
Well,
rule
they
us?
govern. Govern.
Govern.
All right,
okay.
govern.
Yeah.
Well, that's the point in a way, because the way they rule or govern is very much what we're going to be talking about. There's been a lot of issue about the standards that these people have. What do we hold them to?
Yeah.
Whether it's a ministerial code of responsibility, the extent to which they have to obey the laws they themselves supervise, just the levels of accountability, how it works, how it should work, what we should expect.
And how the politics get involved in all of that. So this whole thing, I'm no fan, you might have gathered this, of Suella Braverman, but this whole thing about her driving test, I mean, who cares?
Well, yes, but clearly people do. It's been a story for quite a while now.
Yeah, I know, but it seems irrelevant. She in the end, she did. I mean, to her point, she did pay the fine. She did lose the points. She might have asked somebody for help to see, is there a way I can avoid this, and you can see her point.
And she asked the wrong people.
And she's not enormously popular, so she can understand that actually sitting there.
And she's got a track record. That's the problem. All these kind of things.
Add them all together.
Yeah.
And then
it's not
Boris,
just her,
obviously.
Yeah.
And,
we also, of course, had Dominic Raab, who's now going to stand down as an MP.
Yeah.
What do we expect of the people who we elect into office? What do we think they should or shouldn't be doing? How do we govern it? That's going to be our subject.
Wow. There's a whole can of worms, and we'll do that next week on The Why Curve, brought to you by Wigmore Associates. See you next week. Thanks for listening.
The Why Curve.